Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And also here, Kirsty Buchanan, who is a special advisor to the Prime Minister, Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Good morning to you.
And Joe Tanner, a political strategist. Hello, Joe.
Hello to both of you.
Thank you both for being here. Lots to come today. We'll be looking at the reorganisation of Downing Street. Another top aide to Sir Keir Starmer is leaving. Stephen Swinford of The Times suggests there might be something of a reshuffle coming next week as well, so we'll look at that. Plus, the latest kite to be flown by the Treasury is looking at applying national insurance to rental income, i.e. hitting landlords. And yes, I've got Kirsty Allsop's quote ready to go. She's been on Times Radio this morning, and she's not very happy with Rachel Reeves' latest potential money-raising effort. Also, we'll be focusing on immigration, again, the story of the summer, and what has changed this week in terms of conversation, in terms of attitudes, in terms of arguments being made around immigration, and how all of this looks as the new parliamentary term is just around the corner. Thank you so much for being with us. You can WhatsApp us your thoughts. The number is 0333 404 6507. Start your message with the word Whitehall. You can listen and subscribe on whatever podcast app this is. Just press subscribe. It's totally free. Or if you'd like to watch us in full high definition. Scary.
Not recommended.
Not for the faint-hearted.
Have a swift drink first.
Viewer discretion advised.
Feel free to search for Whitehall Sources on YouTube and subscribe to the channel there. We would love to welcome you on YouTube.
Do we have to have like one of those warnings if people...
Yeah.
No,
we have to tick the box that says adults only, not suitable for children.
Advisory recommended.
Right, let's start with immigration, shall we? Because this week, Nigel Farage and the Reform UK party unveiled Operation Restoring Justice. This is their plan that aims to deport up to 600,000 asylum seekers over a 5-year period. Of course, if they were to win the next general election. Their plan includes withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights, repealing the Human Rights Act, suspending the Refugee Convention, and negotiating returns agreements with countries such as Afghanistan, Iran, and Eritrea. Nigel Farage has extremely constructively, I think, warned of the risk of major civil disorder unless urgent action is taken. Worth noting, there's been something of a kind of U-turn, I think, from Reform UK over the last couple of days. They had to clarify that women and children would be exempt from deportation during the first 5 years. Anyway, there are still obvious legal, ethical and political implications of all of this. Kirsty, the narrative continues to be driven by Nigel Farage. I do wonder if what he is saying here is matching what other politicians have wished they could say, but now Nigel Farage is the one kind of leading the charge on saying it.
Yes and no, I think, is the unhelpful answer to that. I think plenty of politicians will be uncomfortable with some of the language he used, standing in front of the most massive Union Jack flag I have ever seen in my entire life. You know, referring to migration in terms like invasion is the sort of language that would have been roundly criticised a few years ago, but now seems to be just an acceptance of you're capturing the public mood, the zeitgeist, quote unquote. So I think some of the language and the $64 million question in this is, is Farage driving the public mood, or is he riding the public mood, or is it just frankly a kind of complex mixture of both, which I think is probably closer to the truth. Look, there's plenty to criticise from a policy point of view about his plans. They are costly, they are, legally questionable, probably subject to endless kind of dragging through the court. I think to some certain extent that almost misses the point here. This is less about delivery right now and more just about campaigning on the I speak for you, I chime with your concerns, and piling on the pressure on Labour, whose to date whose ability to respond to this crisis has been insufficient to its scale.
And let's pick up on that, Joe, because there is a kind of criticism that Labour are not presenting, they're not offering a compelling counter-narrative to all of this. They branded his plan as a gimmick. Does that feel like enough strategically? Should Labour be attacking harder or not engaging with Farage? What are the options for the Labour government?
I think that's the million-dollar question, really, because on the one hand, you've got a series of statements being made and a fairly weak rebuttal from the government. You've got the Tories claiming that a lot of what's being suggested is sort of a rehash of things that they were planning to do. And what you've not got is anyone really grappling with the situation. And so, the returns agreement that was heralded as everyone at the time sort of said, well, it's pretty flimsy. The numbers are really poor. And the government haven't really been on the front foot given the numbers that are being sort of published in terms of arrivals and just pretty sorry state of the system in terms of what it's actually doing. We haven't actually seen a lot of senior ministers out. We've seen ministers probably in the sort of the junior ranks doing the traditional turning up and sort of speaking media-wise because of, they have a rota and the rota must be stuck to. And I'm sure they all wanted a summer break because theirs was cut short last year. But that's just not how it works. At the end of the day, Nigel Farage has managed to grab a considerable amount of attention this summer simply by having a plan and a grid that he has been sticking to, to the point where we've even seen people like Ryland Clark on ITV's this morning having some people have called it a rant. Some people have said he's just chiming with the public mood. But, talking about the issue on a pretty sort of, a fairly sedate, easy watching program mid-morning on national television. We are seeing a significant shift, and I don't think the government have grappled with this at all. I think they're going to come back probably around conference and say, oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. But by then, it's this feeling that they're on the back foot and they're only saying things because they've been attacked so heavily and they haven't lent in
not
or
leading. Yeah, they're following.
They're not leading at all. Let's face it. They're just not, and they're also not coming up with anything that resembles a suitable and effective plan. Supposedly, their plan for change was supposed to be to do that, but they haven't. They criticised the Tories for a lot of what they didn't do. But it doesn't feel that they've been achieving much more since they've been in, and they've had over a year.
Yeah. What about, Kirsty, the intervention of people like Jack Straw, former Home Secretary, who used the phrase, or encouraged the decoupling of from the ECHR? Keir Starmer's been pretty strong on this. Former human rights lawyer Sir Keir Starmer has been pretty strong on sort of sticking by the Convention on Human Rights, but there is a growing sense that he might be an outlier in that, especially if people like Jack Straw and indeed David Blunkett are making similar calls that actually now is a time to start sidestepping it in order to take action in the interest of the public.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? David Blunkett and Jack Straw, both former Home Secretaries themselves. He's also had criticism from veteran backbench MP Graham Stringer on this. And I suspect in private, and a lot of red wall Labour MPs are putting an awful lot of pressure on Number 10 to move further and faster in terms of tackling it. I mean, the reality is this is a conversation that is now being had right across Europe. It's a discussion that's being had in France at the moment. Merz ended up as the Chancellor in Germany in large part because one of the things he promised to look at was disapplying Germany from the ECHR. It's a relatively easy procedure to do. You simply serve notice. You can unilaterally withdraw. You serve notice and 6 months afterwards you are out. But I mean, that's the kind of technical version of it. The reality is you'd be challenged in the courts, and it would probably drag through. But, again, it all kind of misses, it misses the point of Operation Load of Old Hooey. Restoring Justice. Sorry, my bad. But the policy bit of it isn't the matter. It's a demonstrable show of political will. Here is a leader saying, I hear it, I get it, I'm going to do something about it. And frankly, whether people think that that's going to be achieved or not is almost kind of besides the point. And after that, again, agenda-setting press conference that has dominated the week, again from Reform, what did Starmer do? He put out a tweet afterwards saying, immigration and tackling the gangs is my number one priority. And well, really? Those of us that are old enough to remember Labour's missions, immigration wasn't even one of them. This has been forced up the agenda by reform, not by Labour's political will, but by reform's determination to push it up to the top of the agenda. And the fact that, former Home Secretaries of the kind of calibre of Jack Straw and David Blunkett are wading into this is an acceptance that, this convention was applicable and came into being 80 years ago. It is now no longer sufficient for the challenges that not us, but all European countries face at the moment.
Joe, is there space for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives to do anything, actually, on this issue? I was going to say sort of reclaim any territory when it comes to immigration. Their record in government is so recent, it is so memorable, and frankly, it is so bad that you have to wonder if Badenoch can forge any sort of path that distinguishes the Conservatives from Reform UK or from Labour.
Well, I'm not sure whether Kemi has got space to do anything, but Philp and Jenrick certainly feel that they do. There is definitely a desire from some of her ranks to say more on this, but in reality, the charge comes back each time with, well, you didn't do anything, you didn't manage to make it happen. And the thing with reform and what Nigel Farage is suggesting is that there is still a huge problem. Kirsty's right about the process in terms of ECHR. Yes, 6 months notice. But that's one bit of the process. There is also supposed to be a Bill of Rights that then would come through. There is going to need to be Lords' approval for certain things that will need to happen. And this is going to be a potential government with nobody in the House of Lords that is a reform peer. There are so many things that there's sort of a series of steps that have to happen. You either have to sort of get elected, then stuff the House full of a load of peers. Who on earth they will be on the reform side, we simply don't know. We may have a view on who some could be, but we won't know. And you've got a Lord's chamber that is stuffed full of, those on all sides of the debate, particularly though with very serious legal experience. The idea, I can sort of foresee a kind of Brexit period almost coming. Sorry, Kirsty, to bring that up again. But you can sort of see a situation where we're going to end up with quite a divided country in terms of what we do and what we don't do, or what we could do and what we can't do. And in a way, it's where we've been already, because you've had this sort of undercurrent of people expressing views about immigration in the way that they used to express views about Brexit. And it started with people just being a bit unhappy. And then they started to feel space to be a bit more forthright in their views. And then it would be the thing that they would start talking about quite ferociously in the pub. And then it would be the thing that at the dinner table would divide generations. Like, that's where we went with Brexit. And you can sort of see a similar situation emerging where we're going to see a replay of the way that, because the way that debate spun out was essentially about taking back control, right? That was the big thing. And that's essentially where Farage is on this whole issue as well, on immigration. It's all about taking back control of who comes in, who goes out, and how that is physically done. And I can see a situation where we're going to be pretty much buried in very technical points, how we get round ECHR, how we leave it, or how it's disapplied, or how parts of it are preserved. And you can see it being the same debate over and over again that we played out with Brexit in terms of its ramifications and the ferocity of the response to it. I think that's where we're headed next.
This is not a rerun. This is part and parcel of the same issue of Brexit. This is unfinished business, and this was always Farage's argument about Brexit. It wasn't, Brexit was not delivered, hasn't been delivered. That is, the essence of his argument. I mean, the irony that sits under all of this, of course, is that a lot of 99% of the boat crossing problem is caused by Brexit. It is caused by the fact that when we left the European Union, we left the Dublin Convention, which is the one thing would have allowed us to scoop up all those people that come on boats, drag them back to France. We now can't do that because it's illegal. It's actually classed as trafficking. So that's the kind of great irony of this. But this is Farage's argument, is that this was never done. And actually, like Brexit, if that happens, Darren, I suspect you're probably right, that's grist to Farage's mill too. Say he's the Prime Minister and he's got a government. He classes himself in the same way as Dom Cummings and Boris Johnson class themselves. We are the insurgent government, the disruptor government, fighting the establishment that's trying to, that for years, for decades, has smashed the idea of nation state. We're trying to stand up for the nation and its secure borders. And these are, activist judges and elitist lords and the kind of, the political elite establishment with their luxury beliefs are trying to prevent us from doing what's right by you, the public, who want to see this happen. So it is, if that happens, it just fuels and forms the entire kind of second part of the Brexit project for Farage, and it actually, I think, in a lot of ways strengthens his hands, provided ultimately that they win. But it gives you an awful lot of disruptor power if you've set yourself as the kind of, insurgents in government against an establishment that's out to get you.
And the public talk about the fact that they think Farage delivered Brexit. Now, he didn't, but he was the one that really helped push it forward in terms of the debate and that referendum happening. They see that as being something that he did, but he can say, yeah, but it wasn't the Brexit that I would have done. So this is where I'm going to have to mop up and sort out the rest of it. But I think what will be interesting is that, to the point about Jack Straw and Blunkett coming out, the fact that there is some division in the Tory ranks, is that in the same way with Brexit, you will see political parties splitting, because you will see within those parties a very different view of how to tackle where we're at. And that's what I think will get very interesting. I think we will end up with parties that will be sort of having groups off in one side sort of saying, yeah, we want out of ECHR. You'll have another group saying, no, we need to hold on to it, or we need to focus on a very specific Bill of Rights. But ultimately, I think you will see political parties being really torn again in the way that they were over Brexit, because people will have very specific views about how to deal with this, and will, as I think we've already said, will have significant pressure in their constituencies based on whether they've got migrant hotels, what the local sentiment is. It will become one of the issues that may even be, is it about your own views, or is it actually about the pressure that your local constituency is under, and therefore that's the route that you take?
Is it something, the ECHR, that can be distilled, perhaps oversimplified, some might argue, as Brexit was for the purposes of a campaign? Is it as kind of politically charged as that, I wonder? Maybe it is at this moment in time, and maybe it is simply, it's the next chapter of Take Back Control.
Yeah, in essence, it's exactly what it is. What you do if you disapply yourself from the ECHR is remove people's automatic right to pitch up on our shores by whatever means and claim asylum. That is why, that is why we were in the problem that we're in, is that, as Ryland Clark was saying, you pitch up, it's not like people pitch up on the shores of Kent and then scatter into the countryside to avoid being caught. They pitch up, they wait to get quote unquote caught, and then they get moved into hotels where they sit patiently and wait a year because of the backlog for their asylum claim to be processed. So actually, if you completely remove that ability to say, if you come by this means, you are not going to be legally allowed to claim asylum, regardless of which country you come from, that is and if you can distill the argument, which you can, I mean, obviously it's infinitely more complex than that, and there are all sorts of laws of unintended consequences, like the Good Friday Agreement, etc. But if you're going into a binary argument with the public about that, that is the crystallization of your argument. People pitching up and being able to automatically claim asylum, regardless of having got here illegally to do so. And once you've crystallised it down to that, I think for most people in the public, it's a bit of a no-brainer.
And they'll start focusing on stuff like Germany, where they're doing it differently, where, they're removing people. You'll see the comparisons with other countries made more and more. And whether those are fair, whether things are being done right, as we would see it as the UK versus somewhere else, the reality is, if you had this debate 15 years ago, the public's view would be very different than it is now, because the public feel they're being squeezed. To go to Ryland's point, they feel that they're being squeezed. and that, their taxes are not paying for services that they're accessing. They feel that their taxes are paying for other people who shouldn't be here. And the more that this goes on, and quite frankly, if it's 6 months if you think realistically, if an election is nearly 4 years away, then 6 months for the ECHR notice to be given and to get out, and then whatever other legal things you're talking about, this could be a problem that could take another 10 years. This is where the pressure is on the government to do something sooner, because just the one in, one out stuff is just not enough.
And actually, I think the comparisons with Europe are both fair and accurate. Like I say, this is a moved into the sort of mainstream of political debate in France. It's moved into the mainstream of political debate in Germany. This idea of disapplying from the ECHR. There is social unrest as a consequence of unchecked immigration and uncontrolled immigration right across Europe. We had riots, I think, in Norway last week. Lausanne in Switzerland, home to my ex-mother-in-law's. I got told off for flushing the toilet after 10 o'clock in Lausanne in Switzerland because it's against the law. But riots there yesterday caused by kind of social unrest of unchecked immigration. So that sense of the social fabric breaking down because we cannot control our borders is something that is being felt right across Europe. And I think whether people like it or not, politicians that, you're right, Joe, 10 or 15 years ago would have been, back to the Overton window point, would have been like kind of the men shouting at buses, nutters in a fringes of public debate, is now kind of mainstream political debate to talk about removing ourselves from, a convention that we've applied to for 80 years, which has policed sort of European borders for 80 years. It's an extraordinary shift in a very small amount of time, but it is caused by the fact that we've not been able to control our borders. We've failed to check untrammeled immigration, and the age of cheap credit and cheap living and growth is over. It doesn't seem to be coming back. A of the political establishment in here, in Britain or in Europe, seems to have an idea of how to fuel and speed growth again. And so when there's a scarce competing for resources, nation state will rise again.
Thanks both for that. It's certainly defined the summer, hasn't it, this conversation? Let's see what happens in the new parliamentary term. Now, is it a bird? Is it a plane? No. It's the latest kite, and the string is attached to the Treasury. Rachel Reeves is... Did you like that? The Treasury is considering a tax increase... Thanks. A tax increase for landlords in an attempt to boost revenue by targeting unearned income, quote, in Rachel Reeves' budget. This is an exclusive from the lovely Aubrey Allegretti, chief political correspondent of The Times, who we love. Officials are examining proposals for applying national insurance to rental income in the hope of raising £2 billion. It's been pushed by some Labour MPs, by some government aides, and apparently an influential think tank as well, to try to fill that black hole of around 40 to 50 billion quid in the public finances. Always remember the red line set by Rachel Reeves before the election, that VAT wouldn't go up, that income tax wouldn't go up, and that national insurance wouldn't go up. Aubrey reports that earnings from property, pensions and savings are largely exempt from NI contributions, although they are, of course, levied at a rate of 8% on other forms of income for employees. So they say Labour are arguing this is a potential source of, great funding in light of the black hole, but here are official figures which show there were £27 billion of net property income as of 2022-2023. That's the latest year for which stats are available. So if we imagine a levy of 8% on that, you'd get £2.18 billion. Kirsty, that's chipping away nicely at the black hole, isn't it? A nice NI levy on landlords' income.
Well, this is what happens when you rule yourself out of coming at, the taxes that together accumulate to something like 3/4 of all the income that comes into the Treasury. You end up casting your net around and giving all the appearance of penny pinching, a couple of billion there, a billion there, or or you're breathing too hard as a middle-class person. Let's come up and tax that too, Now, look, I will declare an interest. My mother died last year and we inherited the flat. Frankly, I rented it out because I couldn't bring myself to let go of it now. But and for which I get the grand total of £407 a month. Now, look, if Rachel Reeves wants to come along and slap her national insurance, I'm not going to, get my pitchfork and storm the barricades over it. But it is just a sort of, if you're, it's back to that kind of middle income, hard-working, everything feels a bit squeezed. Here's a little something to make life a little bit nice. Oh no, let's put a tax on that because I have created a £50 billion black hole. You, kind of middle England, middle Britain, will have to pay for it. Leaving aside that, let's put it another way. So my mother's flat is in a lovely, attractive coastal region. If I'd put it on the market, there is every chance that it would have been bought by someone as a second holiday home. It's a very pretty place on the coast, so it's very close to London. So someone from London would have bought it for a weekend property. What I actually did in terms of providing it to the rental sector was allow a woman to move into it so she could be closer to her family. So my guess is she'll be a long-term let there, as opposed to a kind of down from London weekend holiday home. And so actually the bigger problem, rather than just aggravating, middle England again with another kind of penny pinching idea, is frankly what it does to the rental market, which is already horrendous and overextended and overinflated in terms of what people can charge, and just make it worse.
It's worth noting also that rental income is already taxed, isn't it? So if landlords have income that is above the tax-free allowance, etc., then they are taxed on it as an income tax.
I have to declare it as for tax purposes. Yeah,
exactly.
Of course I do.
And in a way, that's part of the problem, is that a lot of people don't declare it, right? So, we go back to this thing of there's plenty of income that actually isn't declared properly and therefore, isn't paid, and is one way that you can find extra money. But this to me smacks of a policy that risks pissing off a lot of people and, quite frankly, being dangerous to the rental market, and could well come back and bite them very, very heftily on the arse. Like, there is a real risk there, because you could have a situation where you do have a lot of properties that suddenly get taken off the market. And what happens then? What happens if those people that rely on rental because they simply cannot get on the ladder? And the idea that, a bunch of properties that then are sold, that are put up for sale, taken off the rental market, are suddenly going to be miraculously affordable to people that are depending on renting now anyway, is just bonkers. So I do wonder if some of this is actually kite flying, so that then whatever they do doesn't look quite as drastic as it was potentially being suggested. And that, we have had this in politics plenty of times where other stuff is suggested and then it doesn't come through. But I don't have that much faith in the Treasury anymore. Like, I just don't, certainly not the people running it for politically. Like, I think there have been, in a way, if you'd just flown kites, but you hadn't had the NX raise in the first place, I think you might have thought, oh, yeah, interesting. But actually you could think, yeah, this is the kind of thing they probably would do.
Well, I was out last weekend with some Treasury types, and they described the mood in the Treasury at the moment as borderline kind of civil war. The effective appointment of Torsten Bell as Labour MP, used to be the head of the Resolution Foundation, as junior Treasury Minister, and to some certain extent Rachel Reeves has contracted out budget planning to Torsten Bell, has gone down like a proverbial turd in a souffle with pretty much everybody in the Treasury. So it's pretty grim there at the moment. But actually, I disagree with you, Joe. I don't think these are kite flying that is really bad, and so when we get there, it'll look sort of better in comparison. I think the essence of these is they look like penny pinching because you're too afraid to go near the things that would actually really dig you out of a hole. Because
I agree with you on that, Kirsty.
You don't
it's
have
more
the
that it's really bad for some people. Is the point? So
and so But just to give you an idea of why it feels so penny pinching, that we're talking about £2 billion feeling like penny pinching. I was reading an article the other day and it was full of facts that blew my mind. But last week we were talking about the fact that, one of the biggest problems we have got is with the gilt market because our interest rates are inflation linked. A big proportion of them are inflation linked, right? So our 10-year gilts are now higher than Spain, Italy and Greece, which are all economies that I think in our age we all kind of think are up there in kind of basket case economies. But get this one, we spend more on servicing our debt in a single month than we spend on policing our borders for a whole year. That is how perilous our situation has become. In G7 terms, in countries, we are an absolute outlier in the amount of money we spend on servicing debt. And I have read, and I don't think it's likely, but it is a scenario that is now being mooted, that if the budget goes spectacularly wrong in the autumn, you might end up with a complete market meltdown, so profound that it will bring down this government and force a general election. Now,
I've heard that. I've heard that.
Whether
being
that's
noted.
people just trying to manifest it by putting it out there, I don't know. But it is, I don't think we have kind of got to grips with the scale of just how teetering on a precipice our economy is right now. How much further out on the plank we are than other countries, which are all suffering. All European countries are suffering from low growth and high indebtedness. I mean, look what's happening in France at the moment. It's likely to bring down, the fifth prime minister for Macron in 2 or 3 years. There's a no confidence vote coming. So a lot of European countries have got this problem, but very few of them have got this inflation-linked interest rate problem that we have, and therefore very few of them are quite as exposed to the gilt markets as we are. I almost want to say, look, if I was Keir Starmer now, I would be turning around to Rachel Reeves and saying, right, you are going to have to go for one of the big three. That will cost you, that will cost you your chancellorship for sure. It might very well cost me my premiership. But if you're trying to dig us out of the bigger black hole that you have put us in, I genuinely can't see another way around it.
Let's just end this particular section, as promised, with some sizzling quotes from the wonderful Kirsty Allsop, for whom I have all the time in the world. She's the presenter, of course, of Location, Location, Location. She's been speaking to Times Radio this morning. I'm just going to read what Kirsty Allsop said. This is the second time in less than a week that I'm popping up on Times Radio. It's because we've got Rachel Reeves / Mary Poppins, who goes out and flies all these kites. And the problem is, this is not fun kite flying. This is economically destabilising. It's literally like having the economy run by Baldrick. She keeps on coming up with cunning plans. She needs to go and sit in a corner and think about how to save money and improve the economy, not constantly be taking money from people, because this will impact tenants. People are selling. The reason they're not able to then sell is because when she mucked around with stamp duty in the last budget, it had a terrible impact. Someone should tell Rachel Reeves to stop mucking about with people's homes. This is tenant bashing under the guise of landlord bashing. If 8% national insurance goes on landlords' money that they're getting in, they're going to add that to the idea that you can just tax the landlord and it won't impact the rent. How is this going to impact tenants? Asks Kirsty Allsop. You're, of course, welcome to share your thoughts. You can also email us, hello@whitehallsources.com, or you can WhatsApp 0333 404 6507. Just a few minutes left, guys, to go inside number 10, because Sir Keir Starmer's replaced the most senior civil servant working in his private office. And then Jerry Pandit was the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, responsible for running the team of officials in number 10. There are reports, there's a briefing that she was seen as ineffective by Sir Keir Starmer, despite being appointed last autumn. The Times reports that she's been moved. Downing Street sources dispute claims that Starmer was unhappy with her or that she'd been demoted. Kirsty, we should start, first of all, with the role of a principal private secretary, I think, for context. What is that job?
Okay, so being a Prime Minister is such a mentally taxing and stretching job that you need primarily 2 other brains to support you in that. So if you think of your chief of staff as a political appointment as being your strategic brain, who keeps the kind of overall government kind of core priorities trucking, your principal private secretary is your tactical brain, if you like. They are everything that the Prime Minister needs in a day-to-day scenario to weed out anything extraneous that the Prime Minister doesn't need to worry about or think about, and let in the things that he does need to think about or worry about. So in other words, you run the entire, in this case, Downing Street department. You're responsible for the smooth running of that. You are responsible for who accesses the Prime Minister and when. You are responsible for conveying to the Prime Minister things that he needs to know and shutting out things that he doesn't. Most importantly of all, you're in large part responsible, along with the Chief of Staff, what goes into his box at night. So if you think of them as the kind of day-to-day tactical extra brain of the Prime Minister, that's kind of what a PPS is. It's an incredibly important role.
That is very helpful.
And they are usually the most powerful person in Britain that no one's ever heard of.
Really? Right, okay. Which is hugely significant. And so then, Joe, we come to the significance of this, which is being placed in a wider context in the reporting this morning, that Sir Keir Starmer is kind of shaking up his team in Downing Street anyway, that he might bring in something of an economic advisor ahead of the budget. Even the replacement to this role is seen as significant. Dan York-Smith, a Treasury tax and welfare expert, ahead of the aforementioned budget. Yeah, economic advisor on the way as well. A new senior civil servant to drive his agenda across government. There could be something of quite a few changes, actually. And this, of course, follows the departure of Sue Gray as Chief of Staff, Matthew Doyle as Communications Director as well, earlier in the administration. What's your take on where we're at?
And a new permanent secretary, Director of Communications appointed, who's due to start in a few weeks as well, in one David Dinsmore, who's moving from News UK. So, I mean, the interesting thing is that it has been long talked about that it hasn't felt that Number 10 really got themselves together relatively early on. You know, there was the friction, there were the issues over Sue Gray, there have been the issues about the boys' club. We've had the concerns about the narrative used in the Island of Strangers speech, which the Prime Minister himself distanced himself from, even though the words were uttered by his own voice. And now this sort of, you know, shuffling around of people and, you know, all sorts of briefing about why. I said a while back that I thought it was very interesting when the economic advisor position was being looked at, and that there was a narrative that they were beefing up the sort of Number 10 operation in terms of being able to look more closely at what was coming out of the Treasury. And at the time I said it, and I can't remember where I said it, I think I might have been on a radio show talking about it, and I was kind of told at the time, oh, well, you know, this is very normal, this is what Number 10 does. I don't buy it at all. I actually think there is a growing distrust about what is going on at the Treasury from Number 10. And that's relatively healthy. There should always be a degree of, there needs to be the check from Number 10 about what's going on at the Treasury. But I think it's growing. I think this is part of a wider concern about confidence. I think there's a huge lack of confidence around the comms. There are growing unrest from other senior figures. I've spoken to a few even just over the summer who have reported back about very difficult conversations in meetings at very senior levels around the communication of key policies, even the language being used around big issues, and whether or not the government was sort of in the right place about something, and a sense that there is I'm not sure if it's the dressing room being lost, but there is no question that if you speak to senior people involved in this government, there is a sense that it is not working still. The engine is not running smoothly still. And that's not just being battered about by what's happening externally, but that is personalities within the top team. It's about how people are actually working together. And what's happening is that I think the noises to the Prime Minister about the reasons for that are varied, starting to be individual grievances, I suppose, almost being played out now, because people are, quite frankly, pissed off at the way that things are being done, and they're unhappy with certain individuals that they feel are tone deaf or are quite aggressive in the way that they're doing things. And at the head of it all is a Prime Minister that it is not felt is really managing the team around him and taking the key decisions when he needs to take them. And I think the wobble over the Island of Strangers speech was probably one of his biggest problems, because to sort of say that was something generated by his team that he then kind of rode back on afterwards because of how it landed was a pretty damning sort of sign that you don't have confidence in the team around you either. And that's not great when you're asking the rest of your cabinet colleagues and your ministers to get behind whatever direction is being set on a daily basis. So I think I thought it was interesting that Swinford was also talking about a reshuffle. It's the worst, though I cannot stress how problematic deciding to reshuffle anyone, particularly ministers, and I know they're talking about it not being cabinet level, but doing this with a party conference, when at party conference, people are paying a lot of money, and it's a hell of a lot of money this year for the party conference season. They pay a lot of money to turn out and have conversations with ministers and with advisors about direction of travel, policy, all sorts of issues that companies have got. And then all those meetings that they had scheduled from July and August ready for late September, suddenly it's a whole new person you've got to speak to, and you've got to get in their diary. And my God, the stress that companies go through, it is another way to really piss off companies who are already fed up with you. And it just adds to those woes. So every government seems to do it, and I don't know why, but they never seem to learn from the last when it's felt that it's a miserable thing to do.
That's an extremely important point that Joe made, from a government that has all but trashed any kind of goodwill it had with businesses in relation to that. Look, I mean, all of this feels like an attempt for your kind of classic September reset. I suspect there'll be a big set piece speech.
Get your popcorn.
So you will have conference, then you'll have set piece speech, then you'll have the budget, etc., etc. Look, and one of the reasons, and Joe's kind of skirted around it and been, if you don't mind me saying so, Joe, a little bit mealy-mouthed about what I suspect you were alluding to, which is, allegations and accusations flying around Downing Street. It's a very, very unhappy place to work at the moment. Lots of kind of allegations surfacing around about bullying, etc., etc. These things only happen when your department is really dysfunctional. And, all of that sets from the top, which is probably one of the reasons why he's, potentially removed his PPS, because there's just a lack of grip and unity of purpose in Number 10. I suspect that the direction of travel and the tensions that are pulling Starmer politically, particularly as we move into a set of elections where he needs to be, frankly, facing more towards the soft left and thinking as much about the issues on the left, because you're moving towards the Scottish Parliament elections, Welsh government elections, and a lot of metropolitan elections next year. I suspect those tensions will also potentially raise the prospect of losing his chief of staff at some point during his tenure, because Morgan McSweeney's entire strategy politically is reform facing. It's about countering the threat from the right. So there's clearly this kind of pull on both sides of this. But look, if I was a journalist right now, and one of the sort of central things that is forming part of a reset at Number 10 is a new economic advisor. Every single lobby briefing, so once you get back into kind of the day-to-day of Parliament coming back, which it is next week, the journalists in the lobby go and talk to the Prime Minister's official spokesman every single day. And every single day between now and the budget, I would ask the PMOS, as we like to call him when we can't be bothered to say the thing out loud, is, does the Prime Minister still have full confidence in his Chancellor? Because I would, I would make the point very explicit that all prime ministers are inexorably tied to their Chancellor. She is clearly out of her depth. She is clearly struggling to get herself out of the hole that she has dug for the nation. And that is his responsibility. We were told time and time again she was his appointment. They were in lockstep about the economy. Her choices at the budget were signed off by him. So right now, if I was, kind of centre-right journalist, centre-right politician, I would be reminding people day in, day out that Rachel Reeves is where she is because Keir Starmer put her there and supported her and is in lockstep with what she did in the budget last year, which we're now trying to dig ourselves out of this year.
But they're also, bringing in Torsten Bell. What does Darren Jones think of that? When Darren Jones was the one that has been very clear about the role that he has played, whether it's the spending review, whether it's previous budget, how involved he's been, and as the key lieutenant, the one often sent out to bat on the airwaves, and suddenly Torsten Bell is sort of being brought in as some miracle hope. for this budget, which, you know, is only, it's weeks away, right? I mean, it's a few months, it's weeks away essentially, which just seems, again, just very behind it feels very behind the curve. It feels like it's a bit late in the day to be making a change like that. You know, it's also, it's a sense of, you know, well, we're looking for new ideas because we're bringing someone in that used to do what he was doing. Well, you shouldn't be having new ideas. What happened to your plan for change that you told us you already had? You should have had all this lined up. You claimed you had a plan ready to go. Well, it's starting to feel like you didn't. And if you did, it feels like that's been put in a very deep, dark box somewhere and buried away. And no one wants to go back and look at it. So, you know, and Kirsty, to your point, I am alluding to some of that, but there's also other stuff. I mean, they've been talking about whether or not the Cabinet Secretary might go because they don't feel that the Cabinet Secretary's up to it. And the Cabinet Secretary hasn't been in post long. So there's been a lot of, I mean, ultimately, it's like everybody around the principals are the ones that are getting the blame for things not going very well. But I go back to the fact that it feels like they're scrabbling around for things to actually launch or do as the answers to the big problems. Well, if you take a step back from that, the plan for change was clearly not there or not ready and was not written well enough or fully thought out when they actually went to the public and went to the electorate for that general election, because it doesn't feel that that's ready to be sort of put into play. Instead, they're now blaming their advisors. Well, are they blaming the advisors for the fact that it hasn't been enacted properly and it isn't being pushed through? Or are they blaming the advisors for the fact it wasn't written in the first place? And if that's the case, they knew that when they were coming to the election, they shouldn't be in post at all.
Joe and Kirsty, thank you both very much. There you are. That's Whitehall Sources for this week. Do share your thoughts, your reactions. Keep in touch. The WhatsApp number is 0333 404 6507. If this is your first time with us on the podcast, press subscribe on your podcast app or on the YouTube channel as well if you're watching along. We're always glad to have you there. We'll drop into your feed again next week, and we look forward to speaking to you then.